I'm not delighted to be following that outstanding talk, but I will do my best. I'm extremely jet-lagged because I live in Dubai, which is over 8,000 miles from here, an 11-hour time difference. So I'm going to do my best to project and provide plenty of energy, but please bear with me. We encroached a little bit on my beautiful slide about who I am. But yeah, I'm consultant architect at Narwhal. I started working with Narwhal in December 2017. So I remember those heady days that Victor showed off on his slide on the back of the bus. Those were great times. I'm a 5-time Microsoft MVP, particularly through the collaboration with the TypeScript team. I also helped contribute the parsing support of TypeScript inside of Babel, and created the projects TypeScript ESLint and Angular ESLint, which, particularly those two, have contributed to, unbelievably, over 12.7 billion installs on NPM, which is kind of wild. I went and looked it up. It's madness. Thank you very much. I feel like Tim Cook now, being like, presenting the numbers of the installs and stuff like that. These are the best packages we have ever made. If that sounded terrible, blame the mic. That was a perfect impression of Tim Cook. So today we're going to talk about where Lerna has come from. You've heard Lerna mentioned in the 2 talks so far. We're going to dig a bit more into the project and where it came from, how it was getting on, why and how Narwhal entered the fray, what we've been doing since we entered the fray, and also where we think the project's going to go, where we're planning on taking the project, the kind of priorities that we have as a team, how it will dovetail nicely with NX, the relationship between the two. And please do provide feedback during this conference if you have Lerna-specific thoughts and questions. Just a quick show of hands in the room of our VIPs. How many people have heard of Lerna before as just a baseline? Vast majority. And how many people have been using Lerna, whether it's for monorepo management or even just publishing packages? Not so many. OK, perfect. So I think this would be a good level of talk. So in 2015, so earlier days than Victor had presented about, obviously back then, things were not quite as hedonistic, much more family values. And yes, I did just frantically produce a slide to dovetail with Victor's comedy behind the curtain. In 2015, it was actually Babel that I'm sure you're all familiar with the Babel project. Back in 2015, Babel was obviously the way that we could provide a possibility to use syntax that hadn't yet landed in the JavaScript engines in our projects. And the team had created a ton of packages that they needed to manage, and managing them across multiple repos was proving to be a pain. In the JavaScript ecosystem at the time, there was no solution for this, and so alongside all of the packages around parsing and plugins and all the language extensions and everything, the Babel team was having to maintain a ton of tooling just around managing these packages. And they brought them together into a monorepo, but then they needed a whole different type of tooling to maintain that. They needed a way to have Babel package A depend on Babel package B and have that reconciled. So rather than having this be something which lived in the repo, which was only available to the Babel team, obviously the Babel folks, prolific open source contributors, wanted to share the value with the ecosystem, wanted to have good separation of concerns. They moved the monorepo specific tooling that they'd built into its own package and into its own org and repository and everything. So the Lerna project was born out of the need to make Babel package management really good at a time where there was no support from package managers. So that's how Lerna came about. What does it actually do for us? Well, we can group its capabilities into 3 main buckets, 3 main building blocks: workspace and package management, running scripts and commands, and versioning and publishing. And if you've used Lerna in the past, you might well have experienced it through one or more of these lenses, because just like with NX, you don't actually have to use the entire surface area of what the library provides to get value from it. And so Lerna also, if you think, again, keep the timeline in your head, we're talking now early 2016, workspace and package management in particular was something where Lerna had to step up in a major way, because PNPM was a twinkle in a milkman's eye, as they used to say in the UK. Don't know if that's a PC expression to say. Jan, the new kid on the block, there was the concept of workspaces was being introduced, but it hadn't really established itself as a mainstream thing, and the NPM client had no support for this whatsoever. This was obviously long before the GitHub acquisition, so NPM did not support multiple package JSONs around the workspace. Lerna really had to provide all of this tooling to make this even possible, and even something you could consider to manage multiple packages. So one of the most important commands, therefore, was Lerna Bootstrap. And Lerna Bootstrap handled this process that Victor touched on about having your package B depend on package A within the same repo, and getting as close to an experience of installing those dependencies from a registry as you possibly could. So it handles symlinking directories inside of node modules to your local workspace so that you can resolve the dependencies in the normal way. Lerna add, convenience command around adding new dependencies to that setup. Obviously, things are more complex in this environment where you've got a mixture of third-party dependencies being pulled in from a registry, the symlinking of Lerna on top. And you could also do Lerna linking, which is a more explicit linking of dependencies outside of the Bootstrap lifecycle process. So put a pin in this whole workspace package management stuff. This is a ton of logic, a ton of code, years worth of development, but also years worth of things outside of the workspace, the package managers we know. So put a pin in this one. Running scripts and commands, obviously this is super important. If you want to manage multiple packages in a repo, you don't want to have to CD into a directory of package A, package B, package C in order to run some shell command or to invoke some NPM lifecycle scripts. If you want to run NPM run test or whatever, you don't want to have to traverse into your directory. You want to be like somebody in an air control tower sat in the root of your workspace, being able to talk to the various packages in your repo, and Lerna run and Lerna exec are what allows you to do that from the root. So again, you might well be familiar with this in the NX context of NX run. Lerna provided all of this early on in 2016 onwards. And of course, the big one, versioning and publishing. Again, npm publish as a command has existed for a very long time, but it had limited flexibility and certainly gave you no way to orchestrate the publishing of multiple packages. Lerna brought this to the table with the Lerna publish command. Technically, originally, there was this very kind of overloaded Lerna publish command, which did everything, versioning, publishing. These days, we have a nicer separation of concern, so that's how I've listed it here. We have Lerna version, which handles going through all your packages, updating the versions, also updating the versions of things that depend on those things in the repo. So if you've got a dependencies or a dev dependencies in a package JSON, it will handle updating those relevant versions for you. And it also supports being able to say, I want to publish all my packages in lockstep with one another, or I want to publish all of these with different versions and maintain that flexibility. And then the Lerna publishing needs to interface with the remote repository, whether that's the npm registry, or whether that's GitHub packages, or Artifactory, or Nexus, or whatever. The Lerna publish command will handle authenticating and publishing and all the rest of it. So that's an awful lot of code, that's an awful lot of users, that's an awful lot of work. So I wanted to give a huge shout out to Daniel Stockman, who, after the Babel team kind of set this up and were maintaining it for a while, Daniel is really the one that maintained the project, was the lead on the project interfacing with the community. One of the reasons I emphasized my open source credentials, if you like, at the beginning of this talk was just to say how much and how deeply I truly feel the kind of toll that it can take on you to be maintaining this free software that thousands, potentially even millions of people are using that you've never met, that you don't know, that nevertheless feel very entitled to complain vociferously at times. It takes its toll, and understandably, the project did plateau, and that obviously doesn't mean that it suddenly lost value. It just means it became a bit less agile and a bit less responsive. So the project was officially marked as not actively maintained for a brief period earlier this year. And just again, just wanted to say thank you. If you wouldn't mind giving a round of applause to Daniel in case he watches this. So that brings us to Narwhal. And we felt very honored that Daniel trusted us with taking over stewardship because he had a choice, and I've seen him give an interview where he did say the reasons why he felt confident Narwhal were the right people to take it forward. And really, we made it very clear that we wanted the project to not just survive, but also thrive. And I think it would have been understandable. I don't think anybody would have been shocked if we had attempted to use Lerna's plateauing as an on-ramp to NX, because as Victor said, we have put a massive amount of effort into supporting the kind of monorepos that Lerna blazed the trail on. And we haven't done that, and we're not doing that. And I'm going to talk more about what we've done since we took over the project. So as much as I would love to tell people that Victor came to me in tears saying, James, I just don't really get monorepo tooling. Please, can you help me with this? I'm overwhelmed and I don't get it. The reality is much more collaborative. These wonderful folks on the slide are the people responsible for the great changes you might have seen so far in Q3. When we first took over, obviously a huge priority for us was dealing with that plateau, which meant thinking, okay, security vulnerabilities, deprecated dependencies in the tool chain. Do we need to change stuff to just clean house and make the project feel maintained and make the community feel reassured? So that's what we did. We focused on that. That was actually quite tricky. It involved rewriting some internals which depended on outdated packages that the NPM team themselves produce, which they've completely abandoned and moved on to a brand new API surface, no types. Yeah, it was a challenge. We wanted to work on a different kind of testing for the repo. The repo came with a lot of unit tests and a lot of what it described as integration tests. But we know from experience, and this was the great thing, was to bring this experience from building NX for 5 years, we know that actually running the tool in the way that the users run it, so that means loading it as a CLI, running it in a process, and capturing the output and the results on disk of running that CLI, is by far the best way to protect against regression. So we introduced that kind of end-to-end testing where we have a local running instance of an NPM registry powered by Vidacio. We publish to it, and then we consume the CLI just like a user would. So we run Lerna publish, we run Lerna version, we run Lerna run, we run Lerna exec. So that's been huge, and we've landed a lot of end-to-end test coverage in the project. We released version 5. This was mainly an acknowledgement of that security work and the refactoring of dependencies that we needed to do. On the surface, not a whole lot changed for users, other than there was no NPM audit warnings of any kind. Thanks so much to Ben for the beautiful new website that we landed for Lerna. As you can see, it's on the bottom of every slide, lerna.js.org. And thank you to Isaac and Yuri for docs contributions and getting the messaging out there about us taking over Lerna and the work we've done. And one of the big things that Austin on the slide landed when he joined Narwhal was adding PNPM support to Lerna, which is huge. So thank you very much to Austin for that work. The community had been asking for PNPM support for a couple of years, I think at that point, maybe over a year. And alongside Yarn and NPM, we've kind of covered the major 3 package managers with that. And of course, thank you to Victor for overseeing this, because ultimately, again, it would be understandable if you might think Victor would have just focused on NX, it's his baby, and could have just sort of been like, James, could you just go off and do this, please? But no, it's not been like that at all. Victor has been completely hands-on and involved, and it makes me feel good as a contributor to Lerna, and it makes me feel like I'm working towards part of the collective effort of Narwhal. So it's been fantastic. So thanks to all these wonderful folks on the slide. So you've heard a bit about this already, but beyond just that initial baseline of making sure that users felt comfortable with us as the stewards, we weren't going to tear down the project, we weren't going to radically refactor it, we weren't going to just get people to move to NX. We did think about what are the things that we've learned from NX beyond the end-to-end testing strategy that we can bring to Lerna to make it better for the users that are already using it. And we've spent an awfully long time and an awful lot of dev hours building the best task runner in the industry and the fastest task runner in the industry. And one of the great things about NX and the way it's architected is we have this core, which you've heard a lot about, which deals with things like caching, task running. It doesn't care about things like React apps, Angular apps, Node, Express, any of those things. So we were already in a place where we could take the important pieces of NX and use them potentially as an implementation detail inside of Lerna. And the thing that really crystallized this for us is actually Lerna Run has always been powered by third-party libraries. Lerna Run has historically been powered by either PMAP or PQ, which are two different promise libraries for orchestrating promises, basically. They work just fine, but they're not powerful task runners in the same way that NX Run is behind the scenes. No concept of caching or anything like this. So instead of having these two implementation details for Lerna Run, why not have a third option, which is the NX task runner? And we found that it was remarkably straightforward to achieve, and we instantly get a ton of benefits. One is the nice terminal output you see on the screen, which, if you've ever used Lerna Run in the past, can be a bit tricky to follow because of how it interleaves the output of different tasks, whereas we've spent a ton of time making sure that doesn't happen with the NX output. You see exactly what you need and no more, and if you want to opt into verbose, you can. So we made this an optional thing to opt into in version 5 of Lerna, where you could say, use the NX task runner, please, and we would switch to that behind the scenes for you instead of PMAP and PQ. And we used it on massive open source libraries like Redwood.js and AG Grid, and we were delighted with the feedback we got from those consumers because it just made things better. Like Lerna Run still works how they'd always used it. These are not NX users. These are not NX workspaces. They just found that their Lerna experience got much better using the commands they had already been using. And as you've already seen a demo of from Victor, we added the Lerna add caching command because, as you've seen, you can run the NX task runner without any configuration, but the real power comes when you tell it, so I want to cache these commands, please. I have these outputs in these locations. And even, as you've seen very recently, you can even say, I have these inputs to the cache. These are the things that if they change, please invalidate my cache and rerun these things. All of that can be configured for Lerna Run now, and Lerna add caching does 90% of the work for you with a single command. So beyond version 5, we've actually released version 6. And because we'd had that experience, we'd used it on major open source repos, we felt confident that the NX task runner implementation details, instead of PMAP and PQ, were now ready for absolutely everybody. So the major change in version 6 of Lerna is that now when you do Lerna Run, it is using the NX task runner behind the scenes, and you will see this kind of output in your Lerna Run commands by default. So that was a very exciting milestone for us. We added a command called Lerna Repair. I'm sure you're at least partially familiar with NX generators at this point. And an NX generator is essentially a function or an async function that works on a virtualized version of your file system so that we don't write everything to disk immediately. We can manipulate the file system in all kinds of ways and then commit those changes to disk if we want to. A repair is a special kind of generator. It's a kind of migration generator, but it's specifically a migration that we know you always want to perform. So you might have heard of NX migrate or even things like ng update in the Angular ecosystem. Those are migrations that you probably want to run, but you could also skip, might not be that important. Whereas the repair command is really config has changed fundamentally in the library since we released this version. You should change your config. It will be better if you do this. And so the Lerna Repair command invokes that kind of generator mechanic behind the scenes, so it's really ergonomic for us to write those transformations on your file system. And the very first one we added was, if you had opted into the NX task runner, so you had a little bit of config in your Lerna JSON, use NX true, that's no longer necessary in v6. So if you upgrade from v5 to v6 and run Lerna Repair, we will just strip that property for you because there's no reason to have it anymore, and we can clean your config up that way. So that's a super simple version of a repair generator, but we will be adding more and more of those over time. If we change anything about the Lerna configuration, we will make it painless for folks to come with us and change the configuration appropriately. Jonathan's done some fantastic work around making the NX console VS Code extension just work with Lerna as well. So you'll hear more about that extension later on today. But it's a fantastic thing where you can just, all you need to do is load the VS Code extension in any Lerna repo, even the ones that are not using the task runner. Even if you're opting out of the task runner, you still get these benefits. You can still visualize your project graph, like Victor showed off earlier today, directly in VS Code. Using the NX console extension. You get, again, there's just these wonderful benefits we get for free by having the experience on both tools. Another minor but kind of useful thing, which I needed for myself, if you do use Prettier, which I'm sure a lot of you do, sometimes your configuration, when Lerna rewrites some of your JSON files, it can move some things around, and that might violate your formatting. So now we will detect automatically if you have Prettier installed in your repo. After we've done Lerna version and Lerna publish, we'll invoke Prettier behind the scenes with your config to make sure that any files we touched in Lerna version and Lerna publish get formatted exactly how they need to be for your configuration. So that was a very exciting release, and please try it out now. If you're using Lerna, please upgrade. So what comes next, the future? Well, we want to make sure that the core workflows are brilliant, which means publishing and versioning. That's going to be a key focus for us in this next phase. We're working on some prototypes, but again, because we have these mechanics and these key primitives in place that we've worked on for so many years in the NX ecosystem, like a generator, we can take the transformations that just happened kind of directly to disk right now, put them through this tiny abstraction of a generator, a function that works on a virtual tree of your file system, and suddenly the dry run flag becomes a distinct possibility for Lerna version and Lerna publish. And this is actually the longest standing feature request in Lerna. There's an open issue that's been open since 2016 for a dry run flag. And I have a working prototype, which you can see an example of the output on the screen, where I can show a preview of not just the file that's going to be updated, but also the change that is being made by Lerna. In this case, I'm doing an end-to-end test, so I've released version 999.9.8. But you can see that I made that upgrade. And the dry run flag is showing me that this is what will happen if you run this command without dry run. So that's hugely exciting, and that will help me enormously when I release Lerna itself. And recoverable Lerna publish would also be fantastic and something we want to work on. If you maintain a lot of packages and the NPM registry goes down halfway through a publish, it can be quite cumbersome to recover from that, because you have to kind of make sure the things, what was published, what wasn't published. And so we'd love to make Lerna publish something that is recoverable automatically. So again, if you remember this slide, Lerna Bootstrap, Lerna Add, Lerna Link, these package management concerns, in 2022, does it make sense for Lerna to have its own custom concept of linking dependencies, adding dependencies, and bootstrapping a workspace? Maybe not. We now have 3 excellent package managers. Since GitHub took over, particularly NPM has caught up a lot. We have PNPM and Yarn blazing the trail on this kind of different approach to installation, and they all have perfect first-class support for workspaces, multiple packages in a workspace. So instead of us spending time fixing long-standing issues, maintaining lots of custom code for a problem that is well solved by the tools that people are already using in every single Lerna workspace, we instead are going to focus our efforts on providing guidance on how to move away from Lerna Bootstrap, Lerna Add, Lerna Link if you're still relying on them for your processes. In most of the instances we've seen, folks are shocked by how much the modern package managers can do if they're just used to Bootstrap and those kind of commands. So we'll be providing a lot of guidance on that to help folks move. And this is something that Daniel, the previous maintainer, was saying for years before we took over, that folks should move away from Lerna Bootstrap. But we didn't want, again, we wanted to take our time, reassure the community. We weren't going to radically change things. In this case, it definitely makes sense to look again, because the ecosystem has changed radically in the last 6 years. In the future, we'll also look at things like a more powerful Lerna create. Again, we have this concept of generators, so maybe there's some things we can do around making Lerna create more extensible. Right now, there's no way to customize it in any way or do any kind of dry run, things like that. We want to continue to build out the great documentation that we've started on lerna.js.org. And of course, we want to make sure the community feels heard and that their contributions get merged in a timely manner, so PR and issue management on the repo. Thank you very much, everybody.